In the last lecture, we created few records in the task collection of our database. So if I go to Firebase, here you will notice that in this tasks collection, we have two records. So if I expand the first record, these are the details in the first record. So basically the task title is a new task, status is started, priority is medium. This is the description for the task, created at and assigned to. In the same way, if I expand the second task, there also we have some details related to that tasks. So currently inside this tasks collection of this database, we have two records. Now what we want is, from our Angular application, we want to fetch these two records from this task collection of this database, and we want to display them in the UI. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go to VS Code, and there I'm going to create another method. So here, let me go ahead and let me create a method. Let me call it as fetch all tasks. Okay. And let's make it a private method, because we don't want any other class to be calling this fetch all tasks method. This fetch all tasks method should only be called from within this dashboard component class. So that's why I'm making it private. Now, in order to fetch data from a database, in order to fetch data from a server, we need to make a GET request. So whenever we want to fetch some data from the server, from a database, we are making GET request. The HTTP verb should be GET. So let's see how we can do that in Angular. So again, in order to make a GET request, first we need an instance of HttpClient class. So here we are asking Angular to inject an instance of this HttpClient class, and we are assigning that instance to this HTTP property. So let's first access that property from here. So from here, let's say this dot HTTP, and again on this HTTP we are going to have some methods, and one of the method is this get method, and we use this get method in order to make a get request. So whenever we call this get method, it is going to send a get request to the server. So the HTTP verb is going to be get. Now to this get method, we need to pass one mandatory argument, and that is the URL to which we want to make the request. So here we want to fetch all the tasks from this collection. So here for this collection, the endpoint is going to be this URL. So this URL is for the database. To that, we need to append tasks. And as we have learned earlier, this tasks is a collection, and a collection is nothing but a JSON data. So what we need to do is we need to use this URL. This is the database URL. Let me copy it. Let's go ahead and let's pass this to this get method. And from this database, we want to access tasks collection. So the name of the collection is tasks, and this tasks, it is a JSON data. So we also need to append dot JSON after that. So from this collection, the collection is basically a JSON data. So from that collection, we want to fetch all the documents. Currently in this tasks collection, we have two documents, these two documents. So we want to fetch these two documents, and we want to display it in the UI. So this get method only takes one mandatory parameter. Then it also has a second optional parameter. If I hover over this get method, it also has a second optional parameter called headers. So using that second optional parameter, we can specify some headers for this get request. Just like we are specifying some headers for this post request here. So in order to specify header for the post request, we pass the third argument, this argument, and there we are setting some headers for this request. In the same way, if we want, we can also set some headers for this get request, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so in this way we are making a get request. Now this get method is again going to return us an observable. So this get method will only send a request to the server if there is a subscriber for that observable. Currently, the observable which this get method is going to return, we don't have any subscriber for that. So in that case, this get method will not send any request to the server. Only when there is at least one subscriber, then only this get method is going to send a request. So let's go ahead and let's subscribe to the observable which this get method is going to return. For that, after this, I'm going to use dot, and I'm going to call subscribe method. Now, in order to make it more readable, let me move it in the next line. Let me also move this URL in the next line so that it will be more readable. Okay. And we are subscribing to the observable which this get method is going to return. And when we are making a get request to the server is going to send us back some response. And we can handle that response by passing the first callback function to this subscribe method. So we have learned in the observables lecture that the first callback function which we pass to a subscriber is the next callback function. And the next callback function gets called whenever an observable returns us some data. In this case, when this get method is going to make an HTTP request to the server is going to send us a response. And when we have received that response, it is going to send that response to this callback function. So we are going to receive that response as a argument for this callback function. So let's simply call it as response. Okay, you can name it anything, but I'm simply going to call it as response because here we are going to get the response, right? And for now, I'll simply log that response in the console just to check how that response looks like. So let's log this response. Now, the next question is, when do we want to make this GET request? We are making this POST request whenever the Create Task button in the form is clicked. But when do we want to make a GET request? Well, let's say whenever the page loads, that time only we want to make a GET request. That means whenever this dashboard component is initialized, that time we want to make a GET request to the server and we want to get all the tasks. So here, I'm also going to implement ng-on-init lifecycle hook. Okay, and since we are implementing this ng-on-init lifecycle hook, it's also a good practice to implement its interface. Now, that is not required here, but still, it is a good practice to implement the interface of the lifecycle hook. So for this ng-on-init, the interface is on-init. So this on-init interface provides this ng-on-init lifecycle hook. So let me click on that. And in order to use this on-init interface, we also need to import it from Angular/Go. All right. And from within this ng-on-init, let's go ahead and let's call this fetch all tasks method. So here, let's simply say this dot fetch all tasks. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let's go to console tab. And here you can see when this page was loaded, it made a GET request to the server and the server returned us this response. In this response, we have an object. In that object, we have two properties. This is the first property, and for this property, the value is this object. And this is the second property. And for this property, the value is this object. So if I expand this property here, this is the key. And for this key, the value is this object. And in that object, we have all the task related details. In the same way, if I expand this property here, again, this is the key for the property and the value for that property is this object. And in that object, we have these 6 properties. All right. So this is how the response looks like. In the response, we are getting an object. In that object, we have a key of type string, and then that key is assigned with a value. And that value is also of type object. Right. So here, let's go back and let's set the type of the response which we are going to get. So again, just like this post method, this get is also generic. And here we can specify what type of response we are expecting. So here we are expecting an object. In that object, we are going to have a key. So I'm writing it within square brackets because we also want to set the type of that key. So we are going to receive a key which is going to be of type string. And for that key, we are going to receive a value. Okay, now what type of value we are going to receive? We are going to receive an object. And that object is going to have these properties. So it is going to have this assigned to property, created at property, description property, priority, status, and title property. And for this type of object, we have already created a class. We have created a class called tasks. So if I go to this model folder, there we have this tasks class. And there also, we are specifying some properties like title, description, assigned to, created at, priority, and status. So here, let me close this create task component.html for now, and let's open dashboard component.ts. And there we can set the type as task. Okay, because the object which we are going to receive for this key, it matches this class. So anytime we will create an object of this class, there also we are going to have these properties, the same properties which we are seeing for that object, for each of these objects. So that's why we can set the type as task. All right. Now let's go back to the web page, and there you see the response looks something like this. So in the response we have an object. In that object we have key value pairs. So this is the key, and for that key this object is its value. Then here we have the key, the property name, and for that property we have this value. Now what we want is, before we use it in our Angular application, we want to transform this data in some way. So what we want is, first of all, we are going to convert this object into an array. And in that array, we are going to have some objects as its element. And each object in that array is going to have these 6 properties. And along with these 6 properties, it is also going to have an ID property. And we are going to assign that ID property with this string value. Now keep in mind that this key value which you see here, it is going to be unique for each document in the tasks collection. No two documents will have the same key. So it is going to be unique. So what we are going to do is, for each of these objects, we are going to add an ID property which we will assign with this key value, so that later we can use that ID property in order to update or delete a document. Let's see how we can do that. So here in the response, we are getting the data. Now we can also go ahead and we can transform that response inside this callback function itself. And that approach is also going to work. Or what we can also do is, since here we are using an observable, we know that this get method is going to return us an observable, we can use RxJS operators to transform the response data. In this way, we will write more cleaner code. Okay, so this get method, it is going to return us an observable, and that observable is going to emit the response data. Now we want to transform that response data. So on this observable, which this get method is going to return, before subscribing to it, we are going to use pipe method. Now, if you remember, we use pipe method when we want to use an RxJS operator. And inside this pipe method, we can specify what operator do we want to use. Here, I want to use map operator. So let's first import this map operator from rxjs/operators library. So let me scroll up, and I'm going to import map from rxjs/operators. Okay, now let's scroll down, and now we can use this map operator. Now to this map operator, we need to pass a callback function. That callback function is going to receive the data which the source observable is going to emit. Here, the source observable is this observable which this get method will return. And we know that this observable, this get method, it is going to return us the response data. So in this callback function, we are going to receive that response data. And now we want to transform this response data. So inside this callback function, we are going to write that logic to transform the data. Now what do we want to do here? We know that in the response, we are going to receive an object. So first, we want to convert that object into an array. So here I am going to create a variable. I'll call it tasks, and initially it will be an empty array. Now what we are going to do is, the object which we are going to receive in the response, it is going to have key value pairs. Right, it is going to have a property with the key, and that key will be assigned with an object. So we want to loop over that object which we are going to receive in the response. So for example, the response looks something like this. So there we are going to receive an object. In that object, we are going to have a key. Okay, and for that key, it will be assigned with an object. Then we will have another key, and that key will be assigned with another object. Let me comment it here. Okay, so first of all, we want to convert this object into an array, and then we want to loop over this object, and for each key we want to get its value. So for that, in order to loop over this object, we are going to use for in loop. So to use for in loop, we use for keyword followed by parenthesis. There we need to create a variable. Let's simply call it as key in, and then we need to specify the object name to which we want to loop over. Here we want to loop over the response, and we are going to get that response inside this response variable, right? Inside this response parameter. So we want to loop over that response object. Then what do we want to do? For each iteration, based on the key value, we want to extract its value. And then we are going to push that value in an array. So first of all, here let's say task.push. Now what do we want to push here? We want to push this object. Okay, so instead of directly pushing this object, since we also want to add an ID property to the object, which we are going to push to this task array, here I'll simply push an object here. And in this object, we are going to have all the properties of this object, which we are going to receive in the response. So there, first of all, I need to access this object. And in order to access this object, we can use its key. So here we can say response of key. Okay, so for each iteration in this key, we are going to receive the key value. Let's say the first key is key 1, the second key is key 2. So for the first iteration, the key will be key 1. Based on that key value, we are going to get its value. So when the key is key 1, in that case, we are going to get this object. In this object, we are going to have some properties. We are going to have title property, description property, assigned to, created at, then priority and status property. So we want to extract all those properties from this object, and we want to make it a property of this outer object which we are creating here. And for that, I'm going to use a spread operator on this. So when I'm using the spread operator, from this object which this expression will return, it will extract all the properties of that object, and it will make it a property of this outer object. Okay, so now in this object, in this outer object which we are pushing to this tasks array, there we are going to have title property, description property, assigned to, created at, priority and status property. And along with these 6 properties, we also want to have one more property called ID. Now this ID should be assigned with which value? It should be assigned with the key value. So with this key. So to this ID, I'm going to assign the key value, the value which this key is storing. Okay, so in this way, we are pushing a new object into this tasks array. And in that object, we are going to have 7 properties. We are going to have title, description, assigned to, created at, then priority and status. And along with that, we are also going to have this ID property. I hope it is clear. And also before we do this, we also want to check if this key, if it is a actual property of this response object, because a response object will also have some prototype, and there also we will have some properties and methods. So we don't want to push those objects which has this key in the prototype. We only want to push those objects whose key is the actual property of this response. So for that, here I'm going to use if statement, and there we will check if this response has own property. Okay, so this has own property returns true if the property exists in that object. But if that property is a part of prototype, in that case, it will return false. And to this has own property, let's pass this key. All right. And now let's move this line inside this if statement. All right. Now, once the iteration is complete, inside this tasks array, we will have some objects. We will have some tasks, right? Currently in the database, we have 2 tasks. So inside this array, we will have those 2 tasks. So finally, from within this map method, we are going to return that tasks array. So we are returning this tasks array. Okay, so this complete code here it is going to return us an array. And in that array, we are going to have task objects. And on that, we are calling this subscribe method. So now this subscribe method, it is no more going to receive the response data. Instead, it is going to receive the data which this map operator is returning. So this map operator, it is also going to return an observable, and that observable is going to emit this tasks array. And since we are subscribing to that, now this callback function is going to receive that tasks array. So here, let's simply call it as tasks. And now we want to log this tasks in the console. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now you will notice that instead of logging an object, now it is logging an array. And in that array, we have two objects. At 0 index, we have this object, and index 1, we have another object. If I expand this object, there we have all the properties like assigned to, created at, description, ID, priority, status, title, etc. And along with these properties, we also have this ID property. And this ID property is assigned with this string value. And if you remember, this string value is the key for this object. So in this object, we don't have ID property, but when we have transformed this object here, there we also have this ID property, which is assigned with this key value. In the same way, if I expand the second object, there also, along with these properties, we also have the ID property, which is assigned with the key of the second document. So this key is exactly this key value. Okay, so in this way, we have transformed the data. We have transformed the response which we have received from the server. Now we can go ahead and we can use this transformed data and we can display it in the UI. And we are going to do that in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.